Well now, since you've been kind enough to watch this channel, I'm not going to try and cover all the themes that are found in the reading set for today, the Gospel reading set for today in the Anglican Communion, which is from John chapter 4, because there are several of them and they're extremely difficult to make sense of in the short time available. I could talk about the discussion about different meanings of water and what the actual significance is of the recognition of Jesus' messiahship that takes place in this passage. Instead, I want to concentrate on two other aspects which are no less important in their way. This is the story of Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman at the well. And the two things that I want to look at are, first of all, the fact that Jesus, with great casualness, without any great sort of condescension, any grand gestures, simply in meeting and talking to this woman, manages to flout at least three of the conventions of his day. First of all, he is a Jewish man talking to a Samaritan. In fact, he's travelling to Jerusalem through Samaria, which Jews never did. Such was the hatred between the two peoples. Secondly, he is a Jewish holy man who is prepared, quite without any sort of fuss, to talk to a woman who is unaccompanied. There are no chaperones there. Jesus is on his own, she is on her own, and they're having a cosy chat. She expresses surprise that he's talking to her at all because she's a Samaritan. It's equally surprising that he's flouting convention in talking to her in the sort of circumstances that he does. And thirdly, there is the fact that her own lifestyle is irregular for the time and the society. She points out that she's had at least 5 sexual partners and is living with somebody at the present moment. But Jesus makes no fuss about this, and nor does John in his recording of the incident. And I think there's something very liberating about the attitude that Jesus takes. As I say, this isn't some grand gesture, this lordly Jesus deciding to be nice and forgiving and accepting towards this apparently unfortunate woman, this foreigner who's living in irregular circumstances. But he just talks to her as an equal in a very casual, chatty way. And they have quite an argument about the relative merits of places of worship of Jews and Samaritans, and also he tries to convince her of the significance of the water that he's offering her, which she misunderstands as talking about the water that she is offering him in his request, in her response to his request for a drink. And so we see the second example, there's one in the Synoptics as well, where Jesus talks to a foreign woman on his own, and talks with her on the level, and they engage in a discussion and an argument in which much is learnt and much is revealed. But the actual revelation in this encounter that I want to focus on in this talk is more to do with where it is acceptable to worship God, and the classic and famous conclusive statement of Jesus that it is now necessary, it is now going to be important to worship God in spirit and in truth, no longer in a particular place of worship. The dispute develops because the Samaritans had a number of holy places. Jacob's well, where the woman is giving Jesus the water, is one of them. The other one was Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans characteristically worshipped, and the Jews, of course, regarded Jerusalem as the holy city, the main place of worship. And instead of getting into a debate about where you should actually worship, Jesus says, well, ultimately, it doesn't matter, because from now on, those who worship God will worship God in spirit and in truth. This is a mysterious phrase, and it's not quite clear what it means, but let's see if we can make some sort of sense of it. It seems to be saying that fundamentally you cannot rely on a particular place, a particular sacred space where God is to be worshipped. No one place is any more sacred than any other. God is present to you in all times and all places, and the worship offered to God wherever you are and whatever circumstances, God is as present to you as he is in the most glorious cathedral, in the most wonderful shrine or place of pilgrimage. And I suppose, historically speaking, this was an important lesson for Jesus' followers to learn, because not very long after his crucifixion and resurrection, Jerusalem, the focus of Jewish hopes, the place of worship where all Jews, wherever they could, wherever they were living, tried if they could, come to Jerusalem to worship. This city was razed to the ground and the temple destroyed by the Romans in the Great Revolt, which culminated in that destruction in AD 70. So I suppose at the very least to counsel people to worship God in spirit and truth and not to be focused on a particular place of worship was actually, after AD 70, sheer common sense rather than necessarily a purely spiritual message. But I think there is more to it than that, because Jesus also says, in a challenging response to the woman's claim about the holy places of Samaria, that salvation will come from the Jews. Now, I wonder what this means. It seems to be saying that even though Jesus' salvation is universal and will be focused on no particular time or place, for God can be and must be worshipped in spirit and truth, this is not some vague and general idea about worshipping God which is cut off from a sense of place, a sense of location, a sense of special origin, of geographical locality, as it were. Salvation comes from the Jews. Jesus seems to be saying that the origin of God's work has begun in this obscure people in a corner of the Roman Empire. This is where it begins, but this is not where God's work will end. And there is an importance in having a sense of place, having a sense of sacredness. It is a limited sense, but it is none the less precious for that. And it is important to many of us to have special places that we go, special places that are important to us, whether they are places a relationship first began or some significant family event occurred, or a place of pilgrimage or a church or other place of worship which is particularly significant to us, and we feel that there, in the words of T.S. Eliot, prayer has been found valid, that it is a place where perhaps we feel close to the transcendent world and particularly close to God. And it is important to have these places, I feel, and it was important to Jesus, who, after all, was on his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, to have a sacred focus where we pray, where we feel particularly close to God. And yet, we cannot rely on such places. This is where our spirituality begins, but it is not necessarily where it ends. For just consider, God forbid, if all sacred shrines, all important places, all the most glorious cathedrals and places of pilgrimage were to be destroyed. Would that destroy the purposes of God? Well, of course it wouldn't. But it is from out of these very important human embedded physical experiences that we can develop the ability, the possibility of worshipping God in spirit and in truth, which is not denying the fundamentally physical and embedded and located nature of our spirituality and our experience, but seeing it as something to be transcended, something from which we move on. And I suppose if you wonder why it was that God should have chosen this obscure part of the Roman Empire to begin but not to end his work, that just seems to be the way God does things. After all, it was through no especial virtue or spirituality or wonderfulness or top nationhood of the Jewish people that God chose that people and that place to begin his work. He just chose them in his own providence and decision, and they responded in gratitude and a sense of humility, regarding themselves as being chosen by God, not having chosen themselves or achieved spirituality by some ladder of the virtues. They responded to what God had done in gratitude, and from that the salvation of Jesus was offered to the world. And if you want to extend this to a rather more cosmic level, consider the following. People often ask, quite understandably, how we can possibly believe that the cosmic creator God should have any concern or interest in a tiny planet and one corner of the Milky Way, which itself is one galaxy among many millions of others. But let's apply the same pattern of God's choice of the Jewish people. If God has chosen this earth, which he may possibly have done, to begin his work of redeeming and healing and fulfilling the cosmos, it was not through any importance of this earth or world, or any importance or virtue or wonderfulness of the human species. It is just that this is where he chose to begin his work. And we cannot begin to imagine what wonderful developments there may be across the universe as God brings his work to fulfillment. This is something we may never in this life know. But if we have been chosen as the beginning, the locus, the location of God's redemptive work for the entire cosmos, our response should not be one of arrogance, the human race being the highest species, the most wonderful beings in the universe because we can think and feel and have consciousness. Maybe we should just respond to God's choice of us as the place to be incarnated as Jesus, to save the world and perhaps the universe itself, in a spirit of wonderment that God has done this, at wonderment of what God is going on to do, which we can only guess at, if that, and a spirit like the ancient Jews at their best, a spirit of humility, that this is where, perhaps, God has begun his chosen work of healing the cosmos. And in that spirit we can cherish and love our location, our geographical, physical embeddedness, but see it as something to be transcended, as we learn not to rely on our origins, but learn whatever happens to this earth on which we live, to worship God in spirit and in truth. And the possibilities for that kind of worship are glorious and endless.